Today we're going to be talking about, this session today is a follow-up on a couple of things. A couple of years ago, when we were an organization called the Work and Learning Knowledge Centre, i.e. when we were funded by a different program in the Government of Canada, since then we've had to change our name because we've got new funding, of course, that's the way it works. But we did present here at CAPLA in 2009 some research that we did on work-related informal learning. And I'm going to present some of those findings again in the light of some new information that's coming in and some new research that we've been doing on effective practices for SMEs that are doing workplace learning training in their work sites. I also have a colleague, John Q. Edwards, who's over there in that corner pretending not to listen here. He'll be doing a presentation right after mine on our other project, which is on looking at worker adjustments. So effective practices or case studies that we've done on work sites that were laying off workers and the types of measures they put into place to get people from those layoffs into new jobs. Obviously, an important potential role for PLAR, not as much PLAR going in that area currently, but there's an area where there's a huge potential for PLAR practice. And I also wanted to follow a little bit, was anyone here for Sandy Howell's presentation yesterday on Manitoba PLAR? A couple of you. Well, that's good because Sandy talked about a lot of the issues that I'm actually going to be talking about today, and has a lot of her conclusions about the type of support that they provide to companies in Manitoba, particularly small companies, which is a lot of what we deal with, are pertinent to this discussion. So if you were at yesterday's presentation by Sandy, hopefully you'll find some strong linkages between what I'm saying and what she said. And if you're not, you'll hear a little bit of the same themes that she would have presented yesterday. Some of the outcomes and results from today's presentations, just to give you an idea. I do want to get people talking a little bit or providing some feedback on what you're hearing, particularly if you are PLAR practitioners or you work with PLAR, to give us some sense. It would be helpful to know how you might apply some of the knowledge that we have been putting together. We're a knowledge-sharing organization, and certainly part of our job is to put the type of information that we develop into the hands of practitioners, policymakers, decision-makers, employers, labor unions, to help them improve their ability to serve workplaces in Canada on the skills training front. So those are hopefully some of the things that you'll come out of the session with today. Just a quick word about, let me just go back here. A quick word about the Centre for Workplace Skills for those of you who don't know it. We're a partnership funded by HRSDC. We're led by Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters and the Canadian Labour Congress, so it's a joint labor business partnership. And essentially what we do is, in very basic terms, is we conduct a lot of research for any given skills issue that we consider to be important or that our stakeholders consider important. We do research on that. Most of it is looking at effective practices to deal with a particular skills training challenge in the workplace. And we go about and do research, and then we figure out ways to get that into the hands of the people who can use that information to make effective decisions about workplace learning. So we hold smart sessions, what we call smart sessions across the country with employers. We do that with the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, for instance, and we bring employers and trainers and others around to talk about the kind of stuff that we've been looking at in our case studies and our research. And we do that in order to get people thinking about how knowledge, a strong knowledge base about good practices, best practices can help them can inform their own practice, whether they're workplace trainers, whether they're people in companies responsible for making decisions about where to spend training dollars, whether they're company owners, whether they're labor unions, etc., etc. So that's the kind of work that we do, and you'll see that's really the focus of what I'm going to be presenting on today, a lot of results from case study research that we've done. And if you're free to take any of the material I've left on the tables here. What I've left for you is a copy of our, and of course all of this is on our website, which I'll give you the address. Oh, in fact, we've got a little postcard there which gives you our website address. So all of this stuff you can find on our website. You've got a paper on informal learning. We've got some case studies from our recent research on effective workplace learning practices in SMEs, of which you have the summary as well over there. And I think in the back here, for those of you who might be interested, Hey Mary, how are you? There's a stack of different case studies from our most recent research, so you can get an idea of what these case studies look like, and they can be downloaded as well. They're really handy. They're very handy reference tools because they give you a very good snapshot of how a company dealt with a particular training, skills identification, skills assessment problem. The types of solutions they put into place, the types of barriers they encountered, the types of partnerships that they had to set up to make those happen, and so forth. So we think those are good learning tools. They're good tools for looking at how to potentially adapt practices that we know have worked and that work well, and see how they can transfer over into other places. And again, for those of you in PLAR, they give you a good up-close view of what the decision-making process around skills training in the workplace looks like. Because it is vitally important to understand the type of environment into which you insert yourself if you are looking to offer some sort of PLAR service, some sort of recognition of prior learning as a potential service, for example, in the workplace. So on that note, I guess I wondered if I could just, if people are comfortable, you don't have to answer, I can go right into the presentation. But I have presented here 2 or 3 years already, for 2 or 3 conferences already at CAPLA. And I did want to ask whether it is in fact important for you as people who are involved in PLAR to understand the factors that influence why and how businesses decide to invest in workplace learning, i.e. training, and why is it important? In other words, why are you sitting here at this session? to ask it more simply. But I would like to know, is there something that you're hoping to find out today? Is there something that you're particularly concerned with in your involvement in PLAR, that the knowledge base that we come up with, which is all provided free, of course, can help you to address a little bit better? Would anyone like to talk a little bit about where they come from and why these sorts of workplace issues and understanding the factors that drive decisions in the workplace about training, why those might be important to you?
In terms of the research that you do, in Nova Scotia, we don't have a lot of large corporations. We have some, and in other parts of Canada, you can see where PLAR has been taken up by some large corporations. But I was wondering about, in your research, if you have uncovered any work with small and medium-sized business and how to attract them in relation to doing more PLAR.
I will answer that. The short answer, I think, is there's. I think that's actually. I had sort of hoped to throw out a discussion question at the end, and that's kind of the discussion question. And I'll tell you why at the outset, because it'll maybe help to provide a bit of context for the rest of the presentation. I think the perception, I think probably any of you have talked to employers or heard employers give you feedback about PLAR. I think the impression that employers come away with is that it's a hugely time and resource intensive kind of process, and they can't even imagine how they would do that on a regular basis with their staff, or even once for that matter. And the reality is, and I'll talk a little bit about the realities of SMEs. Those of you who saw Sandy talking yesterday will have heard this already. But I mean, the reality is that most of them don't have a formal, when I say, sorry, SMEs, I mean small, medium-sized enterprises, for those of you who don't understand. Small enterprises, less than 100 people, medium-sized, 100 to 500 people. Most of them aren't doing any kind of formal skills assessment whatsoever, or organizational needs assessment, so they haven't even figured out what they want to do as a business and how the skills are going to get them there. Much less are they at the point where they can, or most of them are, much less are they at the point where they can do PLAR. And if you heard Sandy Howell's presentation yesterday, one of the critical factors, I think if you asked Sandy, she would tell you this, and probably you've seen this yourselves, those of you who've had contact with workplaces, is that the kind of work that the Manitoba PLAR program does is the kind of work that they probably would have to do on an ongoing basis for most small and medium-sized companies. So something like PLAR is at least perceived as something that that really small companies will not ever be able to do on their own. And therefore, in the case of Manitoba, the government steps in with a program where they don't just provide PLAR, they provide essential skills, they provide other types of assessment and that kind of thing. But they certainly, there's a big challenge there. So the question I am going to throw back to you is, given what we know about SMEs, or what you will hopefully have learned that's new about SMEs and learning and informal learning, where can PLAR go in there? I myself don't need to be convinced about PLAR and recognition of prior learning. I certainly mention it when I talk to employers, but the minute you start describing it, a lot of employers certainly do think, that seems expensive, and I don't know how could I, if you've got 20 people in the company, how can I, let one or two of them off to go do this sort of intensive portfolio process or other recognition process. So it's very tricky. And if anyone has had experience doing this with employers and have had success, it would be really great to hear about that, because as an organization, the center would be very happy to actually profile and feature that and show other people how that's worked. Maybe Mary, you guys have had some luck with that. Anyway, so the research I'm presenting again is work-related informal learning. That's an older piece of research. It was in fact done by CAPLA. The lead investigator on that was Christine Wehack at Thompson Rivers University, who many of you probably know, or some of you may know. She did an excellent piece of research for us. Gail Hall of Recognition for Prior Learning was one of the people who were on that research team as well. They did that for us. And then the second piece of research was done by the Conference Board of Canada, and that's a very recent piece of research. That's where the case studies that you have in front of you were taken from. And that's a collection of 45 case studies on effective workplace learning practices in SMEs. So I really am going to be trying to focus on small and medium-sized enterprises today to talk about what makes them so special, what makes them so, the kinds of problems that are really peculiar to small-sized companies. And really, when I say that, I mean when we talk about companies with less than about 50 people in them, then things get very, very difficult in terms of assessing training, assessing people's skills and knowledge and experience, in terms of developing a strategic training plan, finding the resources to do training, finding the time for people to take off to do training, and all that kind of stuff. So small companies are in a particularly challenging situation. Some other research that we've done, I've mentioned most of this already. I won't go over it very quickly. I will say that we do have a project in the pipe that's going to come out in December on organizational training needs assessment. So how SMEs have done effective work in assessing the needs, not of their learners, but of the organization as a whole. So that's in the ideal world. What you have in any company is a strategic plan for where the company wants to go, not in terms of training, but where the company itself wants to go. And then the training plan is tied closely, training or learning plan, and I'll get into the distinction in a sec, but a training and learning plan that's well aligned with those business objectives. And to get that alignment and to figure out how you're actually going to develop people to give you the skills and knowledge and expertise that you need them to achieve the company's goals, you need an organizational needs assessment of some kind. And from there, that's where you figure out whether and how to assess learners' needs within the company, or workers' needs. So that'll be a critical piece of research for the PLAR community, because you can't just, offering PLAR in isolation from any of these other things that need to be done can make it a bit more difficult to make a strong case for why it's such a good tool and why it's such a good technique and process and why it can be of benefit to workers and employers. It has to fit into ideally it should fit into a broader strategy for understanding where a company wants to get to with the skills it currently has and with its vision for where it wants to get with skills. So we're talking about what companies here in Canada and across the world are doing in this area that are particularly effective. I don't particularly mind if anyone has questions of clarification or anything. If you want to just raise your hand, if you don't know what I'm talking about, or if I do sometimes get on a run and then sort of slip into jargon, so I don't want to If I do that, please just let me know that I'm making no sense, and I'll be happy to explain or clarify anything. Are there any questions for the moment? Right. I'm going to skip over that. I'm just going to focus on why focus on SMEs, just to make it very clear why we're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises in Canada. SMEs they make up the majority of companies in Canada. Companies with less than 500 people are the vast majority of businesses in Canada. And of those, companies with less than 50 people are a huge proportion, and even companies with less than 10 people are a very large portion of that overall 40% or 2/3 or so of Canadian businesses, which are small and medium-sized enterprises. And that has very important implications for the dynamics of how those companies work, how decisions are made, and particularly how those decisions are applied to skills training. And of course, because there's so many companies that fit that category, there are... Was there a question? Sorry, Don. I think it's all of employment, total. So Don had asked me, I'll repeat the question. Don had asked me whether that's all of employment or just private sector employment, and I believe that that's all employment across the board. So small and medium-sized enterprises are very important, because if we have productivity problems in Canada, if we're looking for drivers of economic growth in Canada, the small and medium-sized sector is a very important one to look at. And they face special challenges and special circumstances, which is why we pay so much attention to them when we're talking about in the types of research, in some of the research that we do anyway. When it comes to skills, they tend not to train people. They tend to do less training than larger companies. The costs of training for them are proportionately higher. The actual dollar cost of training, of sending someone off for training, is relatively higher for them, often. And then there's all sorts of opportunity costs that are higher for them as well, so that they have to send people. If you have 10 people in the shop and you need to send 3 of them off, for example, to get trained in something, you've lost 30% of your workforce for the time that they're training. If you're in a large company, even if you have to send the same proportion of people, if you've got 1,000 people, you might not face the same kinds of disadvantage or burden on your resources and on the time of your people. They're more vulnerable to things like skills shortages, retention of workers, adopting new technologies. All of this is the stuff I'm quoting you from various recent research sources. Some of it very recent, but most of it from the past 10 years. But all of this stuff is fairly well documented. I'm not going to get into all of the sources. Our research reports that you can get online get into these sources, and we can provide others as well. Oops, sorry. Skills shortages are an issue in certain sectors, are a major issue in many sectors, are a big issue for certain occupations. Certainly if you're talking about the skilled trades, I think there's a lot of talk, Mary, since you're in Nova Scotia now, all the implications of these new shipbuilding contracts in Halifax, what that's going to do for not only the big companies, the shipbuilding companies that need to find tradespeople and other technical and professional people, but also the smaller companies who are probably going to lose some people because all of those people are going to do the shipbuilding. So where are they going to find those people? So retention is a big issue, skills shortage is a big issue. And generally speaking, small companies face some significant barriers to adopting new technology. And that's important because adoption of new technology is a linchpin of growth and of innovation in a lot of companies. So if there are those types of barriers, then they have significant issues there. Now, all of those barriers or problems ultimately have some implications for the types of skills that those companies have among their workers, the types of things that their workers know how to do, and potentially what those companies might have to do if they were in a position to do so in terms of providing training and learning activities of one sort or another to their workers. And the final thing, and we see this very much when we deal ourselves at the center with employers directly, is that they are very much focused on short-term survival. So this is back to the question that Mary Morrissey had asked about why, about SMEs and their potential involvement or use of recognition of prior learning. Most of them, a lot of them, and the smaller they are, the more likely this is to be, but a lot of them are very much focused on the very immediate term. So the work that we do as a center is to really try to convince organizations or employers, businesses of all types, why it's helpful to have a strategic approach to training and how it's possible for even a small company to take that kind of strategic approach to planning training, to assessing it properly, to aligning it with the business's goals or whatever. But the reality is still that a lot of small companies in particular are very much focused on short-term survival. So it does mean that things like PLAR are difficult to convince someone about when the mindset or the concern at the moment is something with very immediate repercussions, and rather than taking a longer look at things. Not that PLAR can't respond to very short-term needs, but it does take somewhat of a strategic approach to be able to start considering PLAR in the workplace as a potential tool to help a company meet its learning needs or its knowledge and skills needs. Just to go back then to our research on informal learning, and this is a list for those of you who are, and I suspect that almost all of you, if not all of you, know what informal learning is, but part of the research that we did here was part of the research that CAPLA did for us, led by Christine Wehak, was try to make some sense of what informal learning is. Because informal learning is a term that's a very theoretical term that appears in the research literature. And we wanted to start to translate that into information that people in workplaces could use and practitioners and so forth. So part of the work that we were trying to do was to provide some helpful definitions of informal learning, to try to capture the different vocabularies that are out there to describe informal learning, and to capture instances of informal learning in terms that a much broader audience can relate to. So those terms there are things that we typically use when we talk about skills, when we talk about training, when we talk about organizations. And all of those are instances of informal learning or types of informal learning or other ways of describing or talking about informal learning. So we wanted to define the concept, clarify it, help to pull apart and sort out some of the different terms that are used. To understand, the second thing is to understand how it functions in the workplace context. And there are different, our work on informal learning is also very much based on case studies. So Christine and Christine Wehak, as lead researcher on this, did pull together some really fascinating case studies on informal learning in Canadian workplaces. In fact, if you want to flip through, if you turn to the very middle, the centerfold of the informal learning report, you'll see a few examples, and they really are most of them are really quite fascinating to see how informal learning works in the workplace and why it's adopted, how it occurs, what conditions prompt its use or prompt people to rely on informal learning methods. But beyond that, what we wanted to get to was to look at not only how it's actually occurring in workplaces, because it's pervasive. We all do informal learning at some point or the other. Some of us do it continuously, on a continuous basis. And the more knowledge intensive a company is, the more that's the case. But everyone does some form of informal learning. And we wanted to not only document what case studies we're looking at in terms of identifying and describing informal learning, but also to start looking at some of the tools, resources, techniques, approaches that could be used to better support informal learning. Now, what's the connection with SMEs? Well, the connection with small and medium-sized enterprises is that for smaller enterprises, and you'll come to this conclusion in a bit, for smaller enterprises, the informal learning can be more effective than more formal types of training. It can be more effective, and I'll get into the reasons in a sec, but informal learning, according to recent research done by the OECD, is potentially more effective than other types of the more traditional forms of training for SMEs. It gets them, it helps them to reach their business goals or their organizational goals more effectively. When I say business, but I mean all of this stuff applies to not-for-profits as well, or government organizations, non-government utilities, public sector. All of these findings here apply to not just private sector organizations, not just for profit. So a lot of you, including ourselves, including myself, come from not-for-profit. So do try to relate what I'm talking about to your own situations, because generally what we're talking about applies just as well. So we wanted to examine how we can actively support informal learning in the workplace. The research does that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about some more recent research on informal learning. There are some interesting findings and trends since we published this research a couple of years ago, or since this research was done a couple of years ago. What is the research, just to give you a quick snapshot of what the rest of this research project looks like. What you have in your hands is only the summary. There's a very large research report, so if you're really interested in it, I would suggest that you go to our website and look up the informal learning, the full report, because there's quite a lot of detail and research that's covered in there, and a lot of discussion about some of what I'm going to go over very, very quickly. One of the interesting conclusions that Christine came to is that it tends to be a little counterproductive to try to sort or try to think about different types of learning and try to put them in that box of informal or non-formal or formal learning. And she relied on research by Helen Colley of the UK and other colleagues who really talk about this continuum of learning approach, where really what they're saying is, and there's just a good quote, is what they said is that in this same research study is that the challenge is not to combine formal and informal learning, but to recognize that they are always combined, and then to understand the implications of their balance in any learning situation. And then what Colley and the others do is propose 4 different types of categories by which learning in a workplace can be analyzed, broken apart, examined, researched, and ultimately understood. And most of that learning, a lot of learning combines some formal elements of instruction with less formal less formal elephants in the room of learning. So informal learning is on one end of the spectrum, if you will, and the more formal type of learning is on the other end of the spectrum. But they're always co-present in a workplace. They're always co-present in a lot of learning activities. And what they provide is a technique really for breaking down and looking at learning in a workplace and how people are interacting with one another as learners and workers figure out what learning looks like. Why is all that important? I mean, it's not. I think what's important about this is that it's not just an academic exercise that Christine was trying to apply in this research that we sponsored. Because it's a tool for examining workplace learning. It's an important approach potentially for figuring out how to design learning, how to conduct organizational training needs assessments, how to evaluate the impact of learning, and so forth. And I guess, and maybe you can tell me how you feel about it, but from the perspective of recognition of prior learning, it certainly would seem to me that it's a valuable approach when you look at learners in the context of the workplace, because learners are it's important to understand that learners are situated in a workplace context and understand the social environment that the workplace is and how that conditions learning and how that generates knowledge and insight and that sort of thing. For instance, I mean, some of the more interesting case studies that we've seen on informal learning is that there's a few very good case studies where workers acquired significant skills in the workplace informally as a means not of helping the company to get to its goal, but to help the company despite itself. So the company would put in a new sort of management tracking system, a new sort of client tracking system, I can't remember what, I can't remember what, it was a counseling services workplace. It was actually it was a not-for-profit. The company put in a new client management system, and the workers felt that that significantly hampered their ability to actually deal with clients more effectively. So through a collective learning process, which was informal, which was in the workplace, they figured out how to better integrate this client management system that was put into place, and then to figure out a whole bunch of workarounds that allowed them to work with their clients the way they usually did, which they felt was the more effective way to do it. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why potentially the company or that this organization could have better approached how to put in this kind of system. But the fact is that there is learning in companies, informal learning, that is resistive learning. In other words, that isn't learning that's aligned with what the company wants people to do so that they get to their objective. Sometimes the company does things that people have to figure a way to work around. And there's significant interactive social learning that goes on when that happens. From a PLAR perspective, and this is me, and just to be very clear, I'm far from being any sort of expert on recognition of prior learning. I understand what it is, but I've never had a closer contact with this. I'm more in the area of workplace skills training on the research side. But it seems to me that why that's important is that if you were doing a PLAR assessment of some kind in a workplace, people might not want to share some of this knowledge or reflect on certain types of experience if they're unsure what's being done with the results of this assessment. B, they might not think of what they're doing as learning. That's another very obvious one. They might not think of the things that they do or the things that they learn as knowledge or experience or learning in any sort of way. So because learning happens for different reasons in a workplace, some of it might not easily surface, and even in the course of sort of a detailed or closely guided assessment. So all of that goes back to some of what Collie was talking about in her work. Mentioned the case studies already in the informal learning research. If I can move on here. Again, I talked a little bit about informal learning and SMEs. Informal learning, I think I mentioned before that SMEs tend to be more reliant on informal learning, partly because they have barriers in terms of cost and time that prevent them from getting into, prevent them from investing in more formal sorts of training. When I say formal, I mean trying to send people off on a course, let them off for 2 or 3 days or whatever, and then have them come back and that sort of thing. And so by nature, they often are more reliant on informal learning. That doesn't mean they're doing it well or that the companies are supporting it well. It just means that it occurs. Now, some of our research is really based on looking at how it can be better supported. Not only this informal learning research, but our more recent research on effective practices in SMEs talks a lot about informal learning support. Research also finds, however, that companies that do pay attention to informal learning and how to support it tend to get better outcomes, better bang for the buck, if you will, from informal learning than from formal learning. And SMEs which have high growth potential, and I won't get into the whole definition there, but growth potential companies, small companies, can see a very strong impact on productivity through informal learning that they encourage or try to foster in the workplace. So that's the research. That sort of is a quick overview of the research that we did on informal learning. Just a couple of really, a few notes about some more recent developments. And some of it is from the research and some of it is from our own observation as an organization that deals extensively with company and training organizations in terms of trends that we've really seen accelerating in the last couple of years. Does anyone know has anyone heard the expression KISA, knowledge intensive service activity? It's pretty brand new. I learned it about it like a month ago, I think, from an OECD study that's going on looking at SMEs. But one of the things that we've been seeing very clearly is, before I get to that one, is the growth, a growth in interest and in some companies, actual implementation of techniques to help to foster informal learning of a social nature. So anything that's group-based, anything that's oriented towards problem solving, anything where you're looking at people being interdependent learners who, for the most part, aren't guided by anything like a trainer or educator or instructor, but who are usually pulled together by some sort of facilitator, which is a very different role than an instructor. So the learning is usually oriented towards a particular problem, oriented towards a particular problem, usually facilitated rather than guided by an instructor or an educator of some kind. And it is an interactive learning process. So people are learning collectively, usually clustered around some particular problem or challenge in the workplace. Some examples of that might be, well, lean manufacturing, for example, has a whole approach to that, a whole formalized approach about how to do that. There are consortia approaches even between companies where company managers or even company owners are learning from each other in some form of social networking. And when I say social networking, I don't mean Facebook, but the second item there, online learning, is a move towards doing that kind of activity that I'm talking about online or through web-based means or through some sort of virtual environment. Clearly that's an area of significant growth. But that second area in terms of the online learning stuff is really, what we are seeing is that it's much more tied to a growing interest in how to encourage decentralized, self-directed teams of people who are engaging in learning, not for the sake of engaging in learning or not with the objective of engaging in learning, but in order to solve problems or to deal with particular processes or to achieve certain other objectives that are not where learning isn't the explicit objective. And that's an important component of informal learning activity generally. KISA, knowledge-intensive service activity, and this is an area that's identified in research. But a lot of case study research done by the OECD now, looking particularly actually at small companies, has revealed a lot of interest in the role that, and this is all informal learning again, in the role that what's called knowledge-intensive service activity has in developing significant learning activities and significant learnings for people who engage in them. So what are examples of KISA? It would be things like bringing a consultant of some kind into a company to assess a problem or to deal with a particular issue or to find a particular solution. It could be people going in a company, bringing a client in to talk about their needs and that sort of thing. It could be debriefing with a work team to see if there's a particular problem, what kind of problem they encountered, and how that might be better dealt with. It could be even dealing with contracting with R&D services. It could be management consulting, any type of services that's brought into the company, or any time people in the company go out somewhere to talk with a client. Those are knowledge-intensive service activities. So it's an exchange of knowledge, or it's some sort of exchange of knowledge between people as where the results of that knowledge will be an input into developing a better product or figuring out how to better operate the company or how to provide a better service. So those are things that everybody does in every company or every type of organization, profit or non-profit, in some way or the other. But the research that's being done now suggests that this is a hugely important area. There's a tremendous amount of learning that happens in that kind of activity. And then again, it is a type of social learning activity. It is group-based. Often it is interactive learning with another person. But the focus, again, isn't learning. It's usually just dealing with trying to find information that helps as an input into doing a particular project, developing a particular product, improving a particular service. But this knowledge and skills acquired out of those processes are incredibly important and are significant. So now there's a lot of interest in this concept called KISA. And I mention it mainly because it's something to look out for if you ever go to any sort of research literature or any sort of the gray literature on this, because I think we'll likely see that coming up a lot more as an area of interest. Just to turn very quickly to our second piece of research, which is our project on effective work-related learning in SMEs. I think, again, for those of you who saw Sandy Howell's presentation, touching on the conclusions and that we're identifying are very similar to what Sandy's coming up with in terms of what she's seeing among SMEs. Our research done by the conference board, which really did, whose main job was to develop 45 case studies of companies across Canada and internationally of small companies that had particularly effective workplace learning practices. And when I say learning, I mean not just training or the learning itself, but also the assessment of learning needs, of the organization's needs, the strategic development of training, the management of training, and as well as the evaluation of impact of training. So effective practices in all of those different areas related to training and learning. We looked at the challenges and barriers, keys to success, the usual things that you would need in a case study to get some interesting information about why the practice was so effective. And again, you have the little case studies some of you have pulled out. Can I just borrow one of yours, if you don't mind? Thank you. We've got 45 different companies profiled in these little case studies. So I would encourage you to go back and look at them because they're rich with information about how companies, what makes them tick when it comes to figuring out why they need to do a better job at training. Just to very quickly address some of the answers that the research came up with, and a lot of this is confirming what we've already known before. But certainly one of the things that's becoming clear and clear in the research literature is that companies get interested in training or assessing the needs of the learning needs of their workers or of the organization as a whole, i.e. get potentially interested in talking to someone who knows something about recognition of prior learning at the moment that they're undergoing some sort of important change. That sounds obvious, but there's a lot of companies, there's a lot of small companies out there, quite frankly, that are sort of on a set course. They're in drive and they're going, and there's no potential need for direction. So it means that a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, a lot of the needs or potential supports that we're talking about aren't necessarily for every company, because it's really the companies that are facing either a crisis or some sort of opportunity. So either a crisis which they have to react to address, which is one form of change, and the other form of change is having identified some sort of opportunity. A new market, if we're talking about a private sector firm, a new market, a new client base, a new service, a new product, etc., etc., etc. A new way of managing, a new way of running the company. All of that will trigger a decision to train, and then that will trigger some concern about knowing what it is that one's own workers, one's workforce knows how to do, what experience, what insight, skills, knowledge that they have. So that's critical. It's critical because that's there's a certain profile of the company which is much more likely to respond to the types of services that training deliverers offer, community colleges offer, recognition of prior learning practitioners and organizations offer. The barriers I won't spend too much time on. We know what they are. It's money. It's mainly money and time at the end of the day. It's resources of some kind. But the important thing is that it's not just money for training, but if I send someone off to train, is there something else that they could be doing in the workplace that would be more valuable than that training? So there's the opportunity cost that often makes employers balk at the idea of sending people off on training. And that's again why informal learning is so important, because a lot of it is immersed in the workplace. It takes place on the job, so people do their jobs while they're learning. And then I talked about a few of the barriers earlier on, essential skills issues, engaging leadership and employees. There's a whole literature out there about the importance of senior leadership believing strongly in the importance of learning and training in the workplace and people's skills and developing them and career development and all that. The importance of senior leadership getting behind that sort of strategy and plan. But then again, also the importance of of line supervisors, for instance, as facilitators of learning. When I talked about, a few slides ago about some of these newer trends in terms of group-based learning and problem solving and that sort of thing, one of the major challenges is, one of the huge challenges for a lot of companies, you find this particularly in manufacturing, but not only manufacturing, is how to get line supervisors, so people who are sort of, on the front line of management at least, to not only do their jobs as supervisors, but how they can facilitate the sort of learning that more and more companies, more and more workplaces are interested in. And that's not a very obvious thing, because that requires a whole set of skills which a supervisor may or may not have. So it requires some motivational skills, which they probably have, but the facilitation skills are not so obvious. And then again, does the company have time to send a bunch of supervisors off to acquire those skills? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. If they don't, how do they surface that learning if they have it? Are they doing other things in their lives that can apply to the workplace? All of that is stuff are issues for recognition of prior learning, practitioners and professionals. The keys to success, and this is what was interesting in the research that we did, is that we looked at the 45 case studies and came up with some analytical conclusions about them, and most of those confirmed what the research data is saying now as well. Keys to success: assessing needs and desired outcomes. I talked about that a lot. Alignment of learning needs and business needs. I won't read out the whole list there. I've talked about all of this stuff. I will say that supporting informal learning was very clearly one of the key areas for success for those companies. So that goes back to the research that we were doing. Also, forging strategic partnerships has been an important measure. I think for a lot of companies in Canada, that has been a key to success. So there's partnerships with colleges, not-for-profits, providing some form of support in this area, and then access to government services were critical for success. A, because they provided some sort of resources or support, but B, again, because there's a lot of knowledge-intensive service activity that goes on when you do these sorts of things. So there was additional learning for the companies that helped them to think more strategically about training. What's critical about that, though, is that, and we find this over and over and over again, is that small and medium-sized employers, here's the problem, that they don't have a small company, even a company with 50 people, is likely not to have a staff person, or a management position that's responsible for employee skills development, training, learning. Often it's something that's done by the human resources function. And the smaller the company gets, you don't have a human resources person in place. So the amount of time or attention that's there to talk about training issues, particularly from a strategic point of view in terms of what it's going to do for the company and how we can use it to advance ourselves as a workplace or as an organization. They don't have the capacity to make those decisions. It's not just capacity to send people off to go train, it's capacity to have someone in place to make those sorts of decisions, recommend strategies, develop solutions, and that kind of thing. And that means that there's often not someone there who can keep track of all of the supports that are available, often in the community, to small companies that are looking to upgrade the skills of their workers, retrain, and so forth. And I think that's an important message for all of us who are in some way or the other involved in trying to convince workplaces about one aspect or the other about workplace learning. So for recognition of prior learning, very often RPL is something that employers will sort of, most employers probably have never heard of it. But even when we're talking about things like essential skills or basic skills training, that a lot of companies think they need, most of the time they don't know how to access those supports. We find this invariably every time we go across the country and talk to employers. I don't know where all of this information is. So it's very important. I mean, it's a very important consideration for all of us who are trying to have some access to the workplace. I'll skip over that. I think I'll wrap up here. I don't want to go I'm already starting to get over time here. So I would like to end it here, and just to see if there's some questions or if we can get back to the question that, that Mary sort of raised in the first place. But what I'd like to, a final thing to refer you to is that we do have our website, workplaceskills.ca. All of the work, almost all of the work that we do now as an organization is collecting case studies of effective, exemplary, good practices in workplace learning of one type or another. So we've got a project that John Hugh, my colleague, is leading on effective practices, learning practices led by labor unions. We've got the current research that I've been presenting here. All of that we've put onto an online accessible database that's on our website. So you can do searching for it, you can browse through case studies, and all of it is organized in, ultimately you can download a case study like the ones that I've provided for you, but you can also search across different categories and that sort of thing. I'd encourage you to go look at that for two reasons. A, if you want to access any of this stuff, it's a great way to look for this kind of thing. If you have a need for detailed case study analysis and information, this is a good place to go. It's not the only place to go, but it's a good place to go. What we're trying to do with this database though is not just profile and load up our research or the case studies that we've come up with. If you have case studies or if you know of a program that's very effective in the broad area of workplace learning, and that can include effective recognition of prior learning programs, we would be happy to work with you to collect that information and enter it into the database. It's not too time intensive, but we would like to have a repository of case-based learning on effective practices that can continue to grow and grow and grow. So if you can think of a company that's doing a good job, an organization that's got an effective tool or support or resource, please contact us because we'll follow up with you and enter it into that database. And as time goes on, we will load our research into there, and we're encouraging people who know of anything that should go into there to contact us to get it in there. The more it grows, the better a resource it becomes. The richer it becomes, the more varied it becomes, the more diverse the information. And potentially, eventually, if we get a larger and larger sort of base of entries in the database, then it becomes a valuable research tool as well. So I'll conclude on that, to thank everybody, and to see whether, I guess I want to go back to the question really is, at the end of the day, and this is potentially for follow-up that we as an organization would do on this as well, but to get some feedback from you if possible about how any of this applies to the work that you do, or whether this raises new challenges for anything that you're doing as recognition of prior learning people. Are there any comments that anyone would like to make, or are there any questions that I can help to answer? John, let me give you, if you don't mind, I'm just going to give you the mic here. Here.
Thanks, Alex. I'm wondering, a few things sparked while you were talking there, and I'm wondering if there's anything in the literature that talks about embedded learning, learning embedded in practice, learning embedded in the workflow, sort of like flow-based learning, personal support environments, personal learning environments, because I see some elements where I see that emerging, but then I also see elements where it's we have a problem, we must go and learn about it, and then we must come back and do our work. And I'm wondering if there are strategies for an employee, possibly an individual employee or a group of employees, to have, it's kind of like a learning companion or a knowledge companion. A friend of mine has an email, SIG file, he says, it's not what you know, it's what you can think of in time. So stuff that would help you think of in time to solve your problems in flow, as it were.
Well, are you talking about another person or
well, I'm probably talking technology,
okay.
But ways of using technology and or groups, connected learning, to solve problems as part of a flow.
Sure. I'm trying to remember whether our case studies look at this closely. I mean, there's certainly there's a lot of knowledge management technologies out there that help to do some of what you're talking about. I think if you look at, if you look at an IBM, for example, the way that they approach learning for their staff it's in a completely different realm from what probably most of us or any of us have ever seen before. So they're really, it is all about, it's all on, a lot of it is online. Oops, I don't want to get feedback here. It is sort of technology assisted with online sort of social learning environments, but it does provide individual workers or employees of the company an ability to organize their own learning, to grab learning objects, to share learning objects with other people, to initiate learning activities with one another, to do all of that sort of thing through a technology mediated sort of environment. But that's IBM, right? So, but some of that stuff is starting to filter through, I think, down to the to other levels. Certainly, the Center for Workplace Skills and Don was involved in helping us to set up an online community of practice for all of our members. Is one way, I think, to do maybe some of what you're talking about. It's, well, one of the steps towards it, yeah.